Declan Whitmore stood at the end of the hospital corridor, loosening his tie. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting that sickly pale glow that made everything look like a bad dream. His voice, when he spoke to his assistant, held the weary confidence of an alpha who believed the world would wait for him. Julian's examinations were over. The doctor had said he was in no danger and only needed to remain under observation overnight. A mild concussion, some bruising, nothing that required actual concern. As far as Declan was concerned, Cale might cry. He might send a few angry messages and refuse to answer his calls for an hour or two. Then he would wait for Declan to return and explain. That was how it had worked for 7 years. Every time Declan had abandoned Cale for Julian, Cale had eventually been the one to make peace. He always came back. He always understood. He always swallowed his pride and his pain and his absolutely justified fury, and he waited with that quiet, devastating patience that Declan had mistaken for weakness. His assistant, Marcus, did not answer when Declan asked about the wedding arrangements. Declan turned and frowned, his alpha instincts prickling with the first real discomfort he'd felt all evening. "What is it?" Marcus swallowed hard. His beta scent was sour with anxiety. "Mr. Whitmore." Cale didn't make a scene. Some of the tension left Declan's face. He'd known it. He'd known Cale would be reasonable. "I knew he wouldn't. Tell the hotel to reset everything for tomorrow. He likes white roses, so don't let them take the arrangements down." The wedding wasn't canceled either. Declan's hand froze halfway to his collar. How could it go ahead without a groom? Marcus looked at him, and there was something in that look that Declan had never seen before. "Pity. He replaced you." The corridor went so quiet that the only sound was the steady beeping of medical equipment from Julian's room. Declan stared at him as if he had spoken another language. "With whom?" "Lucian Voss." In an instant, every trace of confidence vanished from Declan's face. The name hit him like a physical blow. Lucian Voss. His boss. The man who signed his paychecks, who controlled his career, who had built an empire that made Declan's ambitions look like a child playing with blocks. The alpha who had been, for 3 years, the distant, untouchable figure at the top of the corporate ladder Declan had been desperately climbing. "Lucian Voss," Declan repeated, the words tasting like ash. "That's impossible. He's in Zurich. He had a flight. He canceled it." Declan's phone buzzed. Then again. Then a third time. He didn't look at it. He already knew what he would see. The headlines. The notifications. The entire world learning that his fiancé had married the man who owned the company Declan had sacrificed everything to rise through. How? Declan's voice cracked. "How did this happen?" Marcus shook his head. "Mr. Whitmore, I think you should sit down." 6 hours earlier, at the Ashford estate in New York's Hudson Valley, Cale Sterling sat in the bridal suite, staring at his own reflection in the 3-paneled mirror. The Omega staring back wore a clean-lined ivory suit, perfectly tailored to his lean frame. The fabric was rich silk, the cut modern and sharp, and it had cost more than most people made in a year. His makeup was flawless, his dark hair swept back in soft waves, and his expression was unexpectedly calm. He had gotten up at 4 that morning and spent 5 hours preparing. The drive outside the estate was crowded with guest cars. Hundreds of people from New York's financial and media circles were already seated. The livestream crew had finished setting up. Everything had been perfect. Declan had left 20 minutes before the ceremony. "Did he say where he was going?" Cale asked, his voice so steady it surprised even him. The wedding planner hesitated, her beta scent thick with distress. Mr. Whitmore received a call. His younger brother, Julian, was in a car accident. He left immediately. Maya Chun, standing beside Cale, slammed the bouquet onto the dressing table. The sound was sharp and final. "Julian. Again." Maya worked with Cale at North Star News and was his closest friend. She knew better than anyone how often Julian had used the same tactic during the past 7 years. A heart scare on Kale's birthday. Too much alcohol on an anniversary. A sudden disappearance during Kale's promotion dinner. Julian had even claimed to have cut his hand in his apartment on the night Declan planned to propose. Every time Declan ran to him. Every time Declan told Kale, "We grew up together. I can't just ignore him." Kale's phone rang. Declan's name glowed on the screen. He answered, but said nothing. "Kale, I'm sorry," Declan said hurriedly. Julian's car hit a guardrail. The hospital thinks he may have internal bleeding. I have to stay with him. You're already at the hospital? Kale asked, his voice flat. Yes. The ceremony starts in 15 minutes. Declan paused, as though trying to calm an unreasonable child. I know. I'll have Marcus notify everyone that we're moving it to tomorrow. Explain it to Grandpa Henry for me. I'll cover whatever the hotel charges. Kale watched the warmth drain from the eyes in the mirror. And what happens if Julian feels sick again tomorrow? Don't attack him right now, Declan's voice sharpened. He's your brother. He is not my brother. The room went still. The words hung in the air, heavy with 7 years of accumulated pain. Julian was not an Ashford by blood. 26 years earlier, a hospital nurse had mixed up 2 newborn identification bracelets. Julian had gone home with the wealthy Ashford family, while the Ashfords' biological son, Kale, had been raised in a violent household by an alcoholic father. The truth had not emerged until Kale was 22, when a database match exposed the mistake. Charles and Eleanor Ashford brought Kale to New York, but they could not bear to send away the young Omega they had raised for more than 2 decades. Julian kept the Ashford name, his room, his trust fund, and his place in the family. Kale was repeatedly told to understand Julian's insecurity. Kale had understood everyone. He understood why his parents could not let go of their adopted son. He understood why Julian feared losing everything. He understood that Declan and Julian had grown up together. He had even tried to understand why he himself was always placed last. No one had ever asked whether Kale wanted to keep understanding. On the phone, Declan lowered his voice, that soothing alpha tone he used when he thought Kale was being irrational. This isn't the time to drag up the past. Julian is waiting for his results. Be mature, Kale. I'll make it up to you tomorrow. How? We'll hold the wedding again. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Kale laughed softly. The sound made unease stir in Declan's chest. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the sound of something breaking. I want a husband who won't abandon me on our wedding day. Kale, we're over. Declan's shock turned quickly to anger. I admit leaving was wrong, but you can't throw away 7 years because of one emergency. You're upset. We'll talk when I get back. It wasn't one emergency, Kale said quietly. It was every choice you made for 7 years. Every time you chose him over me. Every time you told me to understand. Every time you made me feel like my pain was an inconvenience. I'm done understanding. He ended the call. His fingers trembled, but his voice didn't waver. He removed the pearl cufflinks his mother had given him and returned them to their box. Maya stepped closer. I'll tell the planner to cancel everything. And if the tabloids print one vicious word, I'll help you sue every last one of them. Kale did not answer. Outside, the musicians had begun the pre-ceremony music. The guests were still waiting in the garden, unaware of what had happened. If Kale canceled now, the next morning's headlines would be merciless. The true Ashford heir abandoned at the altar, the adopted son wins again. Omega left waiting while Alpha runs to his ex. That was exactly the ending Julian wanted. Kale picked up his phone and found a number he had not called in years. 3 years earlier, a fire had broken out during a charity gala. Kale had gone back through the smoke to help a trapped server. Near the stairwell, he found Lucian Voss unconscious, his alpha scent nearly lost beneath the acrid smoke. Kale had dragged him to a window and stayed with him until firefighters got them both out. When Lucian woke, he had said only one thing to Kale. I owe you my life. If you ever need anything, call me. Kale had never imagined he would actually use that promise. The phone rang once. A deep, controlled voice answered. Kale. Kale blinked. You saved my number. I told you I was waiting for you to ask. In a private lounge at Teterboro Airport, Lucian Voss stood before a wall of glass. Beyond it, his plane waited to depart for Zurich. He was a tall alpha, broad-shouldered and imposing, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that missed nothing. His suit was immaculate, his posture perfect, and even over the phone, his presence felt enormous. Kale tightened his grip on the phone. Where are you? Teterboro. You haven't taken off? 10 minutes. Kale closed his eyes. I was supposed to get married today. I know. The groom left. There was a 2-second silence. When Lucian spoke again, his voice was colder. Where did he go? To Julian. This time. Lucian said nothing, but Kale could hear the shift in his breathing. You said I could ask you for anything. Kale continued, forcing the words out. Yes. I need a groom. The boarding light flashed in the distance. Lucian looked through the glass at his waiting plane. Do you need me to help you finish a ceremony? Or do you need a real husband? Kale went still. He had only been trying to save the last of his dignity. He had not thought beyond that night. I don't know, he admitted. I only know I won't let them turn today into the humiliation they planned for me. Lucian picked up his coat and looked at his assistant, Ethan. Cancel the flight. Then he spoke into the phone. What time is the ceremony? 6. Delay it 40 minutes. You're coming. Wait for me. After the call ended, Kale remained motionless. Maya stared at him. Who was that? Lucian Voss. Maya's mouth opened, but no sound came out for several seconds. Lucian Voss of Voss Capital? Kale nodded. What did you ask him to do? Be the groom. Maya collapsed into the nearest chair. Kale, do you understand what you just did? That man he's untouchable. He doesn't do public appearances. He doesn't do personal favors. The press has been trying to get a photo of him for years. And you just called him, and he said yes. I saved his life. You saved his life, and he's been waiting 3 years for you to cash in that favor. And you just used it to make him your replacement groom at a wedding where your ex-fiancé is his employee? Kale met her eyes in the mirror. Yes. Maya covered her face with both hands. This is insane. This is the most insane thing I've ever heard. And I'm so proud of you I could cry. 40 minutes later, the chapel doors reopened. The guests had grown restless. News of Declan's departure had begun to spread through the crowd like wildfire. Some people felt sorry for Kale. Others could barely conceal their satisfaction. Many were certain he would never show his face. The whispers grew louder, more pointed. Did you hear? Declan left him at the altar. For that Julian boy, the adopted one. The Ashford family will be the joke of New York by morning. The real heir couldn't even keep his alpha. Then the musicians began the wedding march again. Every head turned. Kale entered the chapel alone. His father was not beside him. Charles Ashford had made it clear he wouldn't walk his biological son down the aisle if Julian wasn't there too. Kale didn't lower his eyes or try to hide. His long train swept across the aisle as he walked toward the altar with such composure that for a moment, it was easy to forget he had just been abandoned. His omega scent was steady, calm, betraying nothing of the chaos inside him. The whispers continued as he reached the center of the aisle. The groom is gone. What is he doing? She can't be planning to hold the ceremony alone. This is going to be a disaster. Kale paused. He felt the weight of every gaze, every judgment, every cruel expectation. For a moment, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Then the rear doors opened again. Lucian Voss walked in wearing a black tuxedo. He had clearly dressed on the way. His bow tie was not perfectly straight, and the shoulders of his coat still carried the chill of early winter. His alpha scent, dark and commanding, preceded him like a storm front. Yet the moment he appeared, the entire chapel seemed to fall under a spell of silence. Voss Capital controlled billions in assets, while Lucian himself rarely attended private social events. The press called him the most inaccessible alpha on Wall Street. He had built an empire from nothing, and he had done it with a ruthlessness that made other financiers nervous. Now he walked past every stunned guest and stopped in front of Kale. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm late." Kale looked at him. "You still have time to regret this." Lucian offered his hand. "I already regretted something 3 years ago." "What?" "Waking up and saying only thank you. I should have asked for your name, your number, everything." His dark eyes held Kale's. "I've been thinking about that night for 3 years." Before Kale could understand, Lucian took his hand and led him to the altar. The officiant looked understandably unsettled by the replacement groom. Declan's name appeared on the original marriage license, so the ceremony could not make Kale and Lucian legally married that night. Lucian did not try to hide that fact. He addressed the room directly, his voice carrying to every corner of the chapel. "Tonight, we will make our vows in public. A legal marriage will require a new license, and I will respect Kale's decision. If he still wants this after tonight, I will go with him to the clerk's office. No pressure, no obligation, just his choice." For the first time all day, Kale truly relaxed. Lucian was not using his humiliation to force him into another trap. He was offering him an exit. The officiant began again, clearly flustered. When Lucian was asked whether he would stand beside Kale, he did not look at the guests or the cameras. He looked only at Kale. "I will." When it was Kale's turn, he paused. Declan had promised that he would never face anything alone, yet he had walked away on the one day Kale needed him most. The man before him had abandoned a flight to Europe because Kale had said he needed him. "I will." Lucian slid a ring, rushed over from a nearby jeweler, onto Kale's finger. It was simple platinum, elegant and understated, and it fit perfectly. When the officiant said he could kiss the groom, Lucian bent closer and whispered, "May I?" Kale nodded. Lucian's kiss was gentle and brief, but it silenced every doubt in the room. His lips were warm, his alpha scent enveloping Kale like a blanket, and for one perfect moment, Kale forgot about Declan entirely. Within half an hour, clips from the live stream had spread across the internet. Runaway groom replaced, Lucian Voss married, and Ashford wedding twist all began trending. The comments were a mix of shock, disbelief, and savage delight. At the hospital, Declan still knew none of it. Julian lay in bed with a small bandage on his forehead and just the right amount of color missing from his face. He held Declan's hand, his omega scent soft and pathetic. "You should go back," Julian said, his voice trembling. "Kale must be devastated." Declan glanced at the examination room door. "I'll leave when the doctor confirms you're all right." Julian lowered his eyes to hide the smile tugging at his mouth. He knew Kale well. Kale endured. Kale waited. Kale swallowed every humiliation. By morning, all of New York would know that the biological Ashford son could not even keep a groom at his own wedding. Julian had been planning this for months. The accident, the timing, the perfect, devastating blow. Julian had no idea Kale had finally stopped waiting. At 1 in the morning, Declan's phone exploded with notifications. He ignored them at first, too focused on Julian's fragile act. Then Marcus called. "Mr. Whitmore, you need to check the news." "I'm busy." "Sir, please." Declan opened his phone and saw the headlines. His blood turned to ice. There was Lucian Voss, his boss, standing at the altar beside Kale. There was his fiancé, wearing another alpha's ring. There was his career, his reputation, his entire carefully constructed world, crumbling around him. He rushed out of the hospital without saying goodbye to Julian. He didn't even notice Julian's cry of protest. He drove to the Ashford estate, but the guests were gone. Crushed white roses lay beside the aisle while workers dismantled the lights. Declan grabbed the wedding planner's arm. "Where is Kale?" "Mr. Voss took him home. They aren't really married." The planner looked at him but didn't answer. Declan called Kale again and again. He never picked up. At last, he went to Kale's Manhattan apartment. Kale was packing a small suitcase. He was not moving into Lucian's penthouse yet. He only planned to stay there for a few days while they worked out the rules of their arrangement. When the doorbell rang, he expected Maya. Instead, Declan stood outside. His tie was crooked, his eyes bloodshot, his alpha scent sour with desperation. He looked like a man who had finally realized that events had moved beyond his control. "What exactly are you doing with Lucian?" Kale remained in the doorway. "It's none of your business." "Of course it is. A few hours ago, you were my fiancé. A few hours ago, you left before our wedding. Julian had an accident. The doctor says he has a mild concussion." Kale stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Maya called the hospital." Kale met his eyes. "You didn't even wait for a doctor to confirm his condition before deciding that hundreds of guests and I could wait for you. In your mind, I can always be moved to tomorrow. I've always been moved to tomorrow." Declan stepped closer. "I thought you would understand. I understood for 7 years. That's the problem. I understood so much that I forgot to ask why I was the only one doing the understanding. Your ceremony with Lucian has no legal force. It will next week." The color drained from Declan's face. "You're doing this to punish me." "At first, maybe part of me was," Kale admitted. "But he asked what I wanted before making a decision." "Declan, that alone is more than you gave me in 7 years." He asked. He actually asked. Declan reached for him. Kale stepped back. "Don't touch me." Declan froze. In 7 years, Kale had never looked at him that way. He was not furious. He was not heartbroken. He looked at Declan as if he were a stranger. Someone unimportant. Someone who had already been forgotten. "I'll give you time to calm down," Declan said, his voice shaking. "When you realize Lucian won't actually marry you, you'll understand this was only an impulse. He doesn't care about you. He's using you for publicity." Kale's expression didn't change. "You don't know him. I know he's my boss. I know he doesn't do personal relationships. I know he's going to destroy your life and walk away." Kale closed the door. The click of the lock was quiet, but it sounded like a wall Declan would never cross again. He stood there for a long time, staring at the wood, unable to comprehend what had just happened. A week later, Kale and Lucian legally married at the Manhattan City Clerk's office. There were no reporters and no family members. Maya and Ethan served as witnesses. When the clerk asked whether they were entering the marriage voluntarily, Lucian looked at Kale first. Kale gave a small nod. Only then did Lucian say yes. Outside the clerk's office, Lucian handed Kale a key. "The primary bedroom is yours. And you. There's a guest room beside the study." Kale looked at him in surprise. "You're giving me your bedroom. The agreement says you never have to do anything you don't want to do," Lucian said. "That includes sharing a room. I won't push you. I won't pressure you. You have time." Kale took the key. "Thank you." "Kale." Lucian's voice was gentle. "You don't have to thank me for basic respect. I wish I'd known you needed to." The word stayed with Kale for a long time. Moving into Lucian's penthouse did not transform Kale's life overnight. He still woke at 7, drove his own car to North Star News, and continued working as an investigative producer. Lucian did not ask him to resign, assign a chauffeur to monitor his movements, or expect him to attend every event on his calendar. He merely told the housekeeper to stock the refrigerator with the oat milk Kale liked, and cleared an entire wall in the living room, so Kale could organize interview notes and research files. They did not see much of each other at first. Lucian often worked past midnight. Kale regularly stayed late at the newsroom. Yet somehow, a lamp began to remain lit over the dining table, and the coffee machine seemed to start humming whenever both of them appeared downstairs at the same time. They were cautious roommates, slowly learning one another's habits. Kale learned that Lucian drank his coffee black, but always left a cup of tea for him. Lucian learned that Kale hummed when he was concentrating and that he had a terrible habit of forgetting to eat. They were also, neither would admit, beginning to look forward to coming home. One evening, Kale came home exhausted from a particularly brutal investigation. Lucian was in the study, reviewing documents. Without thinking, Kale collapsed onto the couch beside him and closed his eyes. "You look tired," Lucian observed. "Rough day." Lucian didn't push for details. He simply set aside his documents and said, "I ordered dinner. It should be here in 20 minutes. Kale opened one eye. "You ordered dinner for me?" "For us." "Why?" Lucian looked at him like the question itself was strange. "Because you're tired. Because you need to eat. Because I wanted to." Kale didn't know how to respond. Declan had never done something like that. Declan had always expected Kale to take care of himself. But Lucian just sat there, patient and steady, like it was the most natural thing in the world to take care of someone without expecting anything in return. 3 days after the wedding, Julian posted a photograph of Kale entering the Ashford estate alone. The caption read, "My brother's first visit home after his wedding. Unfortunately, his new husband is too busy to come with him. Does anyone know how I can cheer him up?" It looked concerned. The comments beneath it were anything but. A replacement groom was never going to take him seriously. Lucian only saved him from public embarrassment. He was probably paid to do it. He had a backup man ready on his wedding day. How long had they really been seeing each other? Declan is the true victim. Kale is just bitter. Kale saw the post while sitting in his grandfather's study. Henry Ashford was the only member of the family who had stood firmly beside him from the day he returned. He studied the ring on Kale's finger before asking, "Are you happy?" "I don't know yet." "Is he kind to you?" Kale considered the question. "He respects me." Henry nodded. "Respect lasts longer than excitement. I've been married 62 years. It's not the passion that keeps you together. It's the respect." At lunch, Julian placed his phone face up on the table so everyone could see the cruel comments. Eleanor Ashford frowned at Kale. "What exactly is your relationship with Lucian? If this is only meant to provoke Declan, end it quickly. Don't drag the Ashford name through another scandal." Charles added, "Voss Capital is negotiating a major acquisition. Lucian cannot devote his attention to domestic life. You should find a way to turn this marriage into a useful alliance." Kale set down his fork. "So you don't care whether I was abandoned. You care whether Lucian can benefit the company." Eleanor's expression hardened. "We're thinking of your future. Julian caused chaos on my wedding day, and neither of you asked a single question. Now that I'm married, you're eager to teach me how to use my husband. You're not thinking of my future. You're thinking of your own." Julian gave a wounded sigh. "Kale, I'm only worried about you. Lucian wouldn't even come home with you. Why sacrifice yourself just to get back at Declan?" Kale looked at him. "Since you're so worried, why don't you show us your complete hospital report? Let everyone see how badly you were injured that day." Julian's smile stiffened. "That's unnecessary. I was in a car accident. What more proof do you need?" "The proof that the accident happened the way you said it did." A deep voice came from the doorway. "He hasn't sacrificed anything." Everyone turned. Lucian entered in a charcoal overcoat, his alpha presence filling the room like a wave. Ethan followed with a suitcase. Kale rose. "Aren't you supposed to be on your way to Zurich?" The flight was delayed. Ethan wisely said nothing. In reality, the plane had already taxied toward the runway. After Lucian saw Julian's post, he ordered the crew back to the gate. He didn't care about the meeting in Zurich. He didn't care about the millions it would cost. He cared about Kale facing his family alone. He came to Kale's side and rested one hand naturally on the back of his chair. "I shouldn't miss the first time I accompany my husband home." Julian forced a smile. "Lucian, it's been so long. I remember when you used to come to our house for dinner. Before Declan started working for you." Lucian's gaze was cool. "You should call me your brother-in-law. And I don't recall any dinners." The air around the table tightened. Julian's eyes immediately filled with tears. "It's only a habit. We knew each other growing up too. Knowing someone does not make you close." Lucian pulled out the chair beside Kale and sat down. His hand remained on the back of Cale's chair, a subtle but unmistakable claim. Charles quickly adopted a warmer manner and began asking about Voss Capital's acquisition. Lucian answered politely without offering a single business commitment. Eleanor cautiously raised the subject of Cale's 10% stake in the Ashford family company. Henry originally gave those shares to him as a wedding gift. Given the unusual circumstances of this marriage, perhaps the family trust should manage them temporarily. Henry set down his fork with a sharp sound. I gave those shares to Cale. No one needs to manage them for him. Lucian added, Cale has his own attorney and financial advisor. His assets are his to control. I have no interest in his inheritance. Julian suddenly said, but Cale just said he might reconcile with Declan. Cale frowned. When did I say that? In the kitchen. You said if this marriage failed, you might go back to Declan. I heard you. It was a complete invention. Julian clearly expected Lucian to react with anger. Instead, he turned to Cale. Did you say that? No. Then I believe you. 5 simple words destroyed every trap Julian had prepared. Lucian took Cale's hand on the edge of the table. His voice was quiet but carried to every person in the room. I don't care whom he loved in the past. I care who thinks they can hurt my husband from this day forward. If anyone tries to undermine this marriage, they will answer to me. Personally. Cale's fingers trembled in his. Their agreement required them to maintain the appearance of a committed couple around family, but there was something in Lucian's eyes that did not look like acting. After they left the estate, Cale noticed Ethan's luggage still in the car. You really came back from the airport. Lucian did not deny it. Why didn't you tell me? You didn't tell me you were coming here. I thought you had important work. Work can be rearranged. Lucian paused. You should stop deciding whether your needs are convenient for everyone else. You needed me. I came. That's how it works. Cale turned toward the window. The remark touched the habit he least wanted to acknowledge. He hated causing trouble, so he handled everything alone. Eventually, everyone around him had learned that Cale would not ask for help. Lucian didn't push the conversation. He merely raised the car's temperature when he noticed Cale's hands were cold. That same evening, Declan studied Julian's medical records for the first time. He'd requested them from the hospital, claiming he needed them for insurance purposes. What he found made his stomach drop. The records showed that Julian had arrived at the emergency room conscious and stable. Imaging revealed no internal bleeding, no fractures, nothing requiring emergency surgery. The claim that he might need immediate surgery had come only through Julian's version of what the hospital supposedly said. When did a doctor tell you that you needed surgery? Declan asked Julian, confronting him at his apartment. Julian leaned against the sofa, his face slightly pale. Everything was chaotic. Maybe it was a nurse. Which nurse? I don't remember. Declan watched him. Why did you call only me? Why didn't you call your parents? Tears filled Julian's eyes. I was scared. You were the only person I could think of. You've always been there for me. In the past, those tears would have ended every question. Now Declan saw Cale standing alone in his wedding suit before an empty altar. He saw the look on Cale's face when he said, "We're over." He saw 7 years of choosing the wrong person over and over again. Julian, that was my wedding day. I know. I kept telling you to go back. But every time you said it, you held on to my hand. You made sure I stayed. Julian's face went white. That's not fair. Was the accident real? Was any of it real? Julian burst into tears. I just wanted to know who mattered more to you. Is that so wrong? I've been losing everything my whole life. My parents, my identity, my place in the family. You were the only thing I had left. Declan said nothing else. He stood and left. He still could not admit that he had destroyed the wedding himself. It was easier to believe that if he proved Julian had lied, Cale would forgive him. But some part of him already knew that wasn't true. Cale had no time to think about either of them. North Star News had begun investigating the Ashford Family Foundation. Nearly $2 million had been transferred during the previous year to 3 supposed youth mental health organizations. Cale discovered that all 3 entities shared the same registered address and that their directors had ties to Julian's publicist. He didn't abandon the story because it involved his family. He disclosed the conflict to his editor and withdrew from final editorial approval so no one could accuse him of controlling the conclusion. He was a professional first and an Ashford second. When Lucian learned about the investigation, he asked only, "Do you need a legal team?" "No. I can't let anyone say Voss Capital is helping me retaliate." "All right." He didn't insist. Several days later, Cale came home to find a public records guide on the dining table, along with 3 company identification numbers that might be connected to the shell organizations. There were no stolen files and no findings from private investigators. Lucian had provided only leads any journalist could legally pursue. A note lay on top, "You don't need my answers. You may appreciate a faster entrance." Cale read it twice and smiled. Lucian emerged from the study. "Did you find something?" "I found out you're very good at respecting boundaries." "Is that a compliment?" "For now." The corner of Lucian's mouth lifted. It was the first time Cale saw him truly smile. It transformed his face entirely, softened the sharp edges, made him look almost boyish. "I have a question," Cale said. "When you said you wanted to pursue me 3 years ago, what does that mean exactly?" Lucian paused. "It means after the fire, I couldn't stop thinking about you. I went to the hospital looking for you. I tracked down your name. I was going to ask you out. And then I saw the engagement announcement. Declan had already proposed. I know. I told myself you were happy. I told myself to let go." He met Cale's eyes. "I didn't. But I stayed away because I thought it was what you wanted." Cale didn't know what to say. The confession hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Their relationship changed through moments so small that neither could say exactly when the change began. Lucian remembered that Cale drank coffee without sugar but wanted something sweet at 4 in the afternoon. Cale learned that Lucian adjusted his cufflinks repeatedly before difficult meetings, not because he was vain, but because it was the only visible sign that he was nervous. They started having dinner together. Not every night, but often. Lucian would cook, surprisingly well, given that he owned one of the most successful investment firms in the world, and Cale would set the table. They talked about work, about books, about everything and nothing. One night, Cale asked, "Why did you really sign that agreement? The 2-year term, the separate property? You could have proposed a real marriage. You didn't have to give me an exit." Lucian set down his glass. "Because I didn't want you to feel trapped. You'd been trapped your whole life. Trapped by your family, by Declan, by circumstances you didn't choose. I wasn't going to be another cage. But you wanted more." "Yes." His voice was honest. "I wanted more. But I wanted you to want it too. Freely. Without obligation." Cale felt his heart pound. "What if I already wanted?" Lucian went still. "Cale, don't say anything." Cale stood up abruptly. "I need to think. I'm not ready to talk about this yet." Lucian nodded. "Take your time. There's no rush." Cale escaped to his room, his thoughts in chaos. But he couldn't stop thinking about Lucian's face when he'd said he wanted more. The peace lasted less than a month. On a Monday morning, photographs of their marriage agreement appeared across entertainment sites. The images showed only selected phrases: 2-year term, separate property, termination by either party. The headlines did the rest. Voss marriage exposed as fake. Ashford heir used staged wedding to punish ex-fiancé. Lucian Voss's multi-million-dollar sham. Julian published a long statement claiming he had always feared Cale was sacrificing his happiness in a moment of anger, but had been too afraid to reveal the truth. He also implied Cale and Lucian had been secretly involved before the wedding, painting Cale as unfaithful and manipulative. Public opinion turned almost immediately. North Star News received demands that Cale be suspended from investigative programming. Voss Capital's board called an emergency meeting, worried the scandal could damage the pending acquisition. Kale examined the leaked images and recognized the background as Henry's study at the Ashford estate. He had put a copy of the agreement in his bag after the family lunch. Only Julian and Eleanor had entered the study that afternoon. When Lucian returned from the board meeting, his expression was colder than Kale had ever seen it. My attorneys will sue every outlet that publishes the full document. A lawsuit won't solve this, Kale said. The harder you try to suppress it, the more guilty we'll look. I'll hold a press conference. And say what? That we signed an agreement, but are deeply in love? No one will believe that. They'll say I'm a gold digger using you for publicity. Lucian's jaw tightened. I don't care what they say about me. I care what they say about you. And I care about North Star. This is hurting everyone. Kale placed a signed termination agreement on the table. We end the marriage. You announced that you were only helping me that day, and that I take full responsibility. The acquisition is protected, and North Star is no longer accused of serving your interests. Lucian stared at the pages. His expression darkened by degrees. You already signed this. It's the simplest solution. For whom? For you, the company, and the newsroom. His voice was dangerously quiet. You left out the part where you asked me. You left out the part where you considered what I wanted. Kale faltered. This is what's best. When you were with Declan, did you always decide what was best for him too? This is different. How? You still believe that if you leave first, no one else will be burdened by you. Lucian took a step closer. You're so used to being the one who sacrifices that you don't even see it anymore. You're so used to being the one left behind that you've decided to leave before you can be abandoned again. But I'm not Declan. I would never abandon you. And I'm not going to let you walk away because you're scared. Kale's voice went cold. And what about you? When you turned around at the airport, sent lawyers, and managed public opinion, did you ask what I actually wanted? You made decisions for me too. You decided to protect me without asking if I wanted to be protected. Lucian went silent. The words hit their mark. It was their first real fight. Kale packed a suitcase and returned to his own apartment. Lucian didn't stop him. Before he left, Lucian said, I won't sign the termination papers. Not because of our agreement. Because I won't let you decide for me whether staying is worth it. That's my choice, not yours. After the door closed, Kale leaned against the wall and finally cried. He wasn't crying because the marriage might end. He was crying because he had realized he didn't want it to. For the next 2 weeks, Kale poured everything into the investigation. He worked 18-hour days, chasing leads and sources. He barely slept. He barely ate. It was easier than thinking about Lucian. Then an emergency room nurse who had been on duty the day of Julian's accident contacted him. I want to remain anonymous, the nurse said. But I need to tell you the truth. Julian's publicist paid me $5,000 to use vague phrases with Declan over the phone. Possible internal bleeding. Emergency surgery may be necessary. It was all a lie. Julian needed 4 hours of observation and could have gone home that evening. Kale recorded the testimony. His hands were shaking. Why are you coming forward now? Because I saw your wedding. I saw what he did to you, and I couldn't live with it anymore. The nurse paused. I have more. There's a dashcam recording from the car. More damaging evidence came from the car's dashboard camera. Before the crash, the driver asked, Are you sure we have to do this today? Julian answered, Today is the only day Declan will come without hesitation. Today is his wedding. He has to choose me. The driver then deliberately struck the guardrail at low speed. At the same time, the Foundation investigation reached its conclusion. The 3 shell organizations had not only paid Julian's publicity team, they had hired coordinated social media accounts to attack Kale, promote the fake marriage scandal, and purchase secretly recorded material. The total amount embezzled was over $3 million. This was no longer jealousy between 2 Omegas raised in the same family. It was organized fraud and embezzlement. Cale gave the evidence to North Star's legal department and sent a copy to Henry. His grandfather read everything in silence. I knew Julian feared losing what he had, he finally said. I never imagined he would go this far. What are you going to do? Henry opened his safe and removed a document. I plan to announce at the annual shareholders' dinner that I am transferring control of my 25% voting block to you. Cale stared at him. Grandpa, I don't need shares to defeat him. This isn't about defeating Julian, Henry said. It's about returning the Ashford family to someone willing to take responsibility for it. You've always been the one who carries the weight. It's time you had the power to match. On the night of the annual shareholders' dinner, Julian arrived at the hotel in a silver suit, his Omega scent perfumed and perfect. He believed Cale had been suspended from North Star. He also believed Lucian would soon divorce Cale to protect his acquisition. Eleanor had even invited the press to witness Julian's appointment as executive chair of the family foundation, supposedly to stabilize its public image. Declan had been invited too. Julian linked his arm through Declan's. After tonight, everything will go back to the way it should be. Declan pulled away. What does that mean? Cale leaves New York. You and I are together. Mom and Dad stop cleaning up his messes. Declan looked at him and for the first time found him frighteningly unfamiliar. Did you arrange the accident? A flicker crossed Julian's face. Why are you asking me that now? Answer me. I only wanted to know who mattered more to you. Is that so terrible? The near confession left Declan motionless. Julian clutched his sleeve. But you came, didn't you? You chose me. I'm not the one who hurt Cale. You are. Julian's eyes were wild. You walked out of that wedding. You chose me. You always chose me. Don't pretend now that you didn't. The last color left Declan's face. She was right about one thing. Even if the accident was staged, he was still the man who had walked out of the wedding. He was still the man who had abandoned Cale at the altar. He was still the man who had made every wrong choice for 7 years. When the dinner began, Eleanor stepped onto the stage to announce the foundation's new leader. At that moment, the rear doors of the ballroom opened. Cale entered in a sharply tailored white suit, his Omega presence commanding despite its softness. North Star's attorney and 2 investigative reporters followed him. A wave of whispers swept the room. Julian tightened his grip on his glass. You have the nerve to come here? This is an Ashford Group shareholders' dinner, Cale said. I own 10% of the company. Why wouldn't I be here? He walked onto the stage and handed an encrypted drive to the technician. The first recording played through the ballroom speakers. Are you sure we have to do this today? Today is the only day Declan will come without hesitation. Today is his wedding. He has to choose me. Julian's face went white. The screens then displayed hospital records, the nurse's testimony, shell company transfers, and contracts for coordinated online attacks. The room's surprise turned into anger. Charles jumped to his feet. Turn that off. Henry rose with the help of his cane. Let him continue. Cale didn't look at his parents. He looked only at Julian. You didn't do this because you were afraid of losing a family. You stole charity money, bought lies, and staged an accident because you believed anything that belonged to me needed your permission first. You couldn't stand that I was the real heir. You couldn't stand that Declan chose me. So you destroyed everything. Tears flooded Julian's eyes. You came back and stole my parents, my identity, and my fiancé. What was I supposed to do? I didn't take Declan, Cale said. He walked to you. He chose you 100 times. The only thing I ever had was my dignity, and even that you tried to take. Every gaze shifted toward Declan. He came forward, his eyes red. Cale, I didn't know the accident was fake. I swear to you, I believe you. Hope flashed across Declan's face. Then you understand. If you had known Julian wasn't in danger, perhaps you would have returned to the wedding. Cale interrupted. But for 7 years, you believed him first and demanded that I understand afterward. You didn't lose me because he told one lie. You lost me because you repeatedly chose every lie that hurt me. You made me the second choice, the afterthought, the one who would always wait. And I'm done waiting." Declan's lips moved, but no defense came. He had none. Cale took out the engagement ring Declan had once given him. He hadn't worn it since the wedding. He had brought it tonight only to return it. He placed it in Declan's palm. "You always said I would wait. Now you know I won't. There's nothing left between us. There hasn't been for a long time." Declan closed his hand around the ring as though he were holding a life he could never recover. Eleanor hurried onto the stage. "Cale, this can be handled privately. Julian made a terrible mistake, but if you give this to the police, you'll destroy him. He's your brother. He's family." Cale looked at his mother. "When I came home at 22, you told me Julian was innocent and begged me not to ruin his life. Now he has stolen charity funds and staged an accident, and you still expect me to protect him. You've never protected me. Not once. I will not carry the consequences of anyone else's favoritism again." Eleanor's face turned ashen. Henry announced that Julian was immediately removed from every position in the foundation and the company. All evidence would be submitted to law enforcement and independent auditors. Then he transferred control of his 25% voting block to Cale. "From today forward, Cale represents my seat." Applause began in the back of the ballroom and spread through the crowd. Cale stood on the stage, finally in control of his own life. At that moment, Lucian appeared at the entrance. He had no public relations team and no attorney speaking on his behalf. He walked to the stage alone, his alpha presence commanding the room's attention. Cale's heartbeat stumbled when he saw him. They hadn't spoken in 2 weeks. Lucian took the microphone. "Some reports about my marriage agreement with Cale are true." The room fell silent. "I proposed the agreement. The time limit, the separate property, and the exit terms were all designed to make sure Cale still had a choice after what happened at the wedding." He looked at Cale. "The false part is that I married him for business." Lucian removed the unsigned termination agreement from his coat and tore it in half before everyone. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the ballroom. "Voss Capital never required me to marry. I wanted to pursue Cale 3 years ago. I was simply too late. When he called me on his wedding day, he wasn't asking for a backup man. I was finally being given the chance to stand beside him. And I intend to stand beside him for as long as he'll let me." Cale's eyes burned. Lucian came to him and lowered his voice so only he could hear. "I shouldn't have tried to solve everything for you. I shouldn't have made you feel that accepting help meant owing me. And I shouldn't have decided to leave for you. That was wrong. I was trying to protect you, but I was also taking away your choice." "I'm sorry," Cale said. "Then let's decide again. Together." Lucian took out the ring they had used at the clerk's office, but didn't place it on Cale's finger. No 2-year limit. No public relations obligation. No one rescuing anyone. Just 2 people who choose each other. "Cale, will you choose to begin this marriage with me for real?" Hundreds of people waited. The room was silent. Cale didn't answer immediately. Lucian didn't rush him. He simply waited. That was why Cale had fallen in love with him. He came when Cale called, but never forced him to follow. He protected him, but stepped back when Cale said he needed space. He said what he wanted while leaving the final choice in Cale's hands. It was the most precious gift anyone had ever given him. Cale extended his hand. "I have one condition. Tell me. You don't get to make decisions for me again. Not alone. We make them together." Lucian nodded. "Neither do you. We're partners in this." Cale smiled. "Deal." Lucian returned the ring to his finger. This time, it felt permanent. After the shareholders' dinner, Declan didn't try to speak to Cale again. He watched from across the room as Lucian took Cale's hand and led him away. He watched as Cale laughed at something Lucian said, his face soft and open in a way it had never been with Declan. Marcus found him standing alone by the bar. "Mr. Whitmore?" "I lost him," Declan said quietly. "I lost him 7 years ago. I just didn't realize it until today." Marcus didn't argue. There was nothing to say. Later that night, Declan received a call from Voss Capital's HR department. His position had been terminated effective immediately. The reason given was professional misconduct. But they both knew the real reason. He had left Lucian's husband at the altar. He had made a fool of the most powerful alpha in the company. Declan couldn't even blame them. He had destroyed everything himself. 1 year later, Kale and Lucian held a small wedding beside the Hudson River. It wasn't a spectacle. There was no live stream, no room full of business guests, and no one disappeared before the vows. Just 30 people who actually cared about them. Maya was the maid of honor. Ethan guarded the rings. Henry sat in the front row, smiling like a man who had finally put down a burden. Kale's parents were invited, but they sat in the back. Kale didn't pretend the past had never happened. He simply gave them a chance to build a different relationship if they were willing to earn it. Julian remained under investigation for fraud and embezzlement. His trial was set to begin the following month. Declan had resigned from his position in the family company and left New York entirely. He wrote Kale many letters of apology. Kale answered none of them. At the end of the aisle, Lucian watched Kale with the same unwavering attention he had shown the first time he arrived as his replacement groom. He looked magnificent in his black suit, his alpha scent warm with emotion. When the officiant asked whether Kale chose him, Kale didn't hesitate. "I do." Lucian's smile was incandescent. After the ceremony, Maya slipped an arm through Kale's and asked, "Have you ever wondered what really changed your life? Was it Declan running away, or was it the phone call you made to Lucian?" Kale looked at his husband, walking toward him. "Neither." "Then what was it?" "It was the moment I decided to stop waiting for an alpha who always left me until tomorrow." He smiled. "And it was the moment I realized the man I should have been waiting for had been there all along. He just needed me to call." Much later, Declan asked Marcus whether Kale had cried or caused a scene at the wedding he had missed. Marcus told him the truth. He hadn't. He had simply chosen another groom. A better alpha, a better man, someone who would never leave him waiting again. That night, Kale and Lucian sat on the balcony of their penthouse, looking out over the city. The lights of Manhattan glittered below them, endless and beautiful. 3 years, Kale said. "You waited 3 years." "I didn't wait," Lucian said. "I just never stopped wanting you." "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Waiting implies I expected something. I didn't. I just hoped. There was always a small part of me that hoped you'd call." Kale leaned into him. "I'm glad I did." Lucian wrapped his arm around him. "I'm glad you did too. Even if you'd called for any other reason, I would have come. You would have come even if I'd just needed someone to fix my sink." "Absolutely. I would have come for any reason. Every reason. No reason at all." He pressed a kiss to the top of Kale's head. "You're the one I wanted, Kale. From the moment I woke up in that smoke and saw your face." Kale closed his eyes. "I love you." The words hung between them, simple and true. "I love you too," Lucian said. "I think I have for 3 years." They sat together in the quiet, the city sprawling beneath them, the future stretching ahead. Kale thought about his wedding day, the humiliation, the betrayal, the desperate phone call. He thought about the man who had answered. Lucian hadn't saved him. Lucian had given him the space to save himself. And that was the greatest gift of all.